Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff, and today's episode is called Spent, as in exhausted, nothing left in the tank. Because quite frankly, that's what so many Israelis are feeling right now. And I want to loop back to an idea I've brought up before, which is the dilemma that I have. As someone who, in many ways, it might be too far to say I've dedicated my life to Israel, but Israel is such a big part of my life, whether it was joining the army as a volunteer when I was 23 years old, serving in combat in Lebanon, moving to Israel 8 years ago with my family, putting two kids through the army and another one going through the process right now, about to join up, writing a couple of books about Israel, and really doing my best to try to spread the word about all the amazing aspects of Israeli life. It is such a magical country. There is so much beauty in it, so much beauty and magic to the people. There really are no people on earth like Israelis. And so much of what I do right now is to try to bring people that love of Israel, that positive side. So I face this dilemma when I come to meet with you and speak to you on a weekly basis. I want to bring that aspect of Israel to you. And yet, right now, I don't feel like I can. I mean, all I really want to do is tell you the truth. And the truth is, Israelis and Israel is in a really tough spot right now. Israelis, more than ever, the ones I'm talking to, are feeling spent. They're feeling like they're at the end of the line emotionally. And there's that part of me that's afraid I'm going to color your own relationship with Israel, that you won't feel as fondly as the country as you do right now. But the fact that you're listening to this, I think it reassures me that you care enough that you'll be able to stick with us even through the fog, even through the difficult times, even if Israel doesn't live up to the utopian vision that so many of us want to have of the place. But the fact is, Israelis are reaching that sort of emotional breaking point. Over the past week, I'm in the US right now, but obviously I talk to Dorit, my wife, daily, multiple times a day. And she told me one story that happened this past week. She was out at a doctor, dropped our son off at the park so he could just play across the street at the park while she was inside at the doctor's office. And a siren went off, an air raid siren. And so my son, 14 years old, alone at the park, shooting baskets, had to find an apartment building nearby that luckily the door was open and he was able to run inside the apartment building and go down to the bomb shelter. I mean, what kind of life is that, where 14-year-olds have to find open apartment buildings with bomb shelters that will take them in? This is Israel in the year 2024. This isn't how it's supposed to be. And later on that day, she ran into a friend of ours. He's a guy named Yaron. He's a mechanic and he's done some work on our car, installing an AV system, and a new screen. Not important. But Yaron told her that he had been at a different park with seven kids, three of whom are his own. And then they had four friends and they were playing on the slides, and a couple were at the skate park. And when this air raid siren went off, he simply wasn't able to collect all seven kids and get them to a nearby apartment building with a shelter. So he and these seven kids just curled up under one of the slides. I mean, think about that. A grown man lying on the ground in the fetal position with seven kids, four of whom aren't even his own, all crouching beneath a slide, which frankly, if a missile had fallen on that park, that plastic slide would not have protected anyone. It was more for the psychological reassurance as opposed to anything that would really protect them physically. And he said to Dorit, he said, I can't take it anymore. I'm done. I'm done with this. Not that there's another option, not that there's somewhere else he would go, but so many Israelis right now are just feeling spent, feeling like they've reached the breaking point. And it's not just the fact that missiles continue to fall and air raid sirens continue to blare. It's the fact that soldiers are dying So I don't want to say every day, but it feels like almost every day we're hearing about new deaths of soldiers. As of this time, I think a few hours ago, another soldier was killed in Gaza, bringing the death toll to 376, if my count is correct. Zichronam livracha. 376 soldiers now over 13 months after the October 7th attacks. I don't think anyone thought it was going to go on for this long. We have 97 hostages still in Gaza, and 70% of Israelis right now are saying that they are ready to end the war, and that means pull out of Gaza. 70% of Israelis, including 50% of Likud backers, those who normally associate with Bibi Netanyahu's party, are saying that right now what Israel should do is end the war, pull out of Gaza in order to get the hostages back. And yet, if you were to poll Israelis, how many believe that that scenario is actually likely? My guess is probably somewhere around 10%, if even that high. I don't know that anyone actually believes that that is a likely scenario that we would end the war and pull out of Gaza to bring the hostages home. So there's this sense of hopelessness um, that's sort of permeating through many Israelis' lives right now. This sense of not really believing that things can get better. You know, Israelis have always had this fantasy that if things ever got bad enough, they could livroach, which means to flee, to go somewhere else. You know, I'll move to Europe, move to Australia, move to the US. But even that fantasy isn't really so palpable anymore. I have a friend in Ra'anana back in Israel. The husband is Israeli, but the wife is Dutch. And they made the decision 3 months ago to move back to Holland, to Amsterdam, because they were just too fed up with everything that was happening in Israel, how dangerous they felt. They had a son who was going to go to the army soon. They didn't want him to serve. They decided to move back to Amsterdam. And we saw what happened just 10 days ago in Amsterdam, where essentially, you know the phrase Jew hunt. That was the phrase used by one of the Dutch ministers, where Israelis were beaten on the streets of Amsterdam. So this idea that we could just shut ourselves off and go somewhere else, I don't think that idea is even realistic for many Israelis right now. I've done a lot of events over the past month. I'm here in the US. And some of these events are related to direct fundraising for Israel, some on behalf of IDF soldiers, some on just on behalf of Israel in general. And a lot of these events, I hear Americans saying, how proud they are to support Israel and how resilient Israelis are and how wonderful it is that Israelis can be so resilient. And in my opinion, I'm not on board with that the same way these American Jews are in these meetings. Part of resilience, Israelis are resilient, but part of resilience is hope. The idea that there is something better down the line. We're resilient because we know things will improve. But I think some of that resiliency might be running out because I don't know how many Israelis really are looking forward and seeing brighter days ahead. Fewer and fewer actually believe, I think, that there is something better ahead, at least in the near future. And I can give you a few examples of why. First of all, in terms of these wars we're fighting, we are still 20,000 soldiers short of what we need in order to fight these wars on the two main fronts that we have, which is in Gaza and in Lebanon. And at the same time that we're 20,000 soldiers short, the ultra-Orthodox are still not only refusing to be drafted into the army, they're simply not showing up on the days that they've been told to show up at the induction center. But as if that weren't enough, they are protesting violently. against soldiers and against policemen as part of their refusal to go into the army. And I think right now, fewer Israelis believe that they will actually go in. So, meanwhile, while regular soldiers are having their times of service extended, reservists are now serving more than 200 days over the past 13 months. 200 days. These are guys with wives and children and businesses. While they're continuing to serve in the reserves, the ultra-Orthodox who are eligible are continuing to get exemptions. And I think there was this hope. I mean, I even expressed that hope at one point that I really thought that would change. Now it just seems like it's going to continue on like this. It's becoming harder and harder to envision how the ultra-Orthodox would actually serve. That even if they were brought by force to the induction center, they would literally refuse to put on the uniform, that they couldn't ultimately be forced, and there are not enough jail cells to hold all of them. So it's more and more feeling like a moot point that they're simply not going to be contributing to our defense needs the way they need to. As I mentioned before, 70% of Israelis now believe that we should end the war and pull out of Gaza if it means that we can get the hostages back. And yet, few of us actually believe that that's going to happen. I certainly don't believe that that can actually happen. I can't envision a scenario where the war would end. And if it's not going to end, the other alternative is that it's just going to keep going on and on. It seems to me that next October, when we reach the 2 year mark of October 7th, there's really no reason to believe that we would be out by then. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm trying to envision a scenario where we actually would pull out, because the minute we pull out, Netanyahu's government would collapse. His ministers who support the war at until Hamas is demolished completely, and how would that actually happen? But those ministers who want to see Hamas demolished completely and want to see Israel occupy Gaza and start building Israeli settlements there once again, they would pull out of the coalition if Netanyahu ended the war. So it's becoming harder for us to picture a light at the end of the tunnel. And meanwhile, it just means that our children will keep on dying in Gaza. And I say children, not sons. I used to say sons, but we've had women soldiers, at least one female soldier killed in Gaza as well. And I've told you before that now, for the first time, women are serving in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. That's a first. And so it's our children who continue to be killed in Gaza and in Lebanon in a war that more and more Israelis are seeing as at least somewhat politically motivated. And the news out of Israel this past week supports that assertion. One of the big stories in Israel right now is that Netanyahu's assistants in the prime minister's office actually were changing the transcripts from meetings that happened on the very early morning of October 7th. So on October 7th, in the very wee hours of the morning, there was a phone call placed to Prime Minister Netanyahu's office to notify him about the attack that Hamas was carrying out. And all of these, by law, have to be recorded, each of these phone calls with transcripts. And it turns out that Netanyahu's assistants have admitted under oath that they actually changed the times of some of these phone calls so as to make it seem like the prime minister, uh, to lessen the responsibility of Netanyahu, to make it seem like Netanyahu was not guilty of being negligent, to make it clear or make it seem like he was acting the way he should have and not neglecting the situation. And this is horrific to Israelis. The idea that there's this internal scandal where Netanyahu's own assistants are doctoring official transcripts for political reasons to try to make it seem like he is less responsible than he is for how events unfolded on October 7th. In uh, one of the recordings, one of the transcripts, the first phone call was placed, and Netanyahu said, call back in 10 minutes. So he knew the attack was happening, but his only response was, call me back with an update in 10 minutes. He didn't have contact with the military. He didn't talk to the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service. He allowed the attack to go on for 10 more minutes before taking any action at all. And it's just really making Israelis lose faith. Again, I said before, when 70% of Israelis believe that we should end the war and pull out of Gaza, that includes 50% of his own backers from the Likud party. So this isn't just a political issue. This is really across Israeli society. And if that weren't enough, now judicial overhaul is back on the table. If you remember, before October 7th happened, Israel was on the brink of civil war because of this policy called judicial overhaul, which would change how judges are picked for the Supreme Court. And these judges supposedly would now be more favorable to Netanyahu and allow him to not have to stand trial for all of these accusations relating to corruption and racketeering and graft. But now judicial overhaul is back on the table, as if this war on two fronts plus Iran were not enough, as if these internal scandals were not enough, and the ultra-Orthodox not serving in the army were not enough. Now judicial overhaul is back on the table. And the way it ripped apart Israeli society before, it could very well rip apart society again. So Israelis, as you can understand, maybe you're feeling a bit spent and exhausted after hearing all this. That's what so many Israelis are feeling right now. Just this sense of where's the light at the end of the tunnel? How are things going to get better before they get worse? And I got to say, on a personal level, this is kind of how I feel right now, too. I told you, I'm here in the US right now on this comedy and book tour, and I know I'm doing good work. I know audiences are coming to me and saying they really appreciate this chance to laugh for an hour, to just escape for a little bit from the tension that they're carrying around as well. People who care about Israel are feeling this kind of psychological duress in their own lives. It's hard to read the headlines every day and seeing what's happening in this country that we love. And so they appreciate the little break and the insights that I bring them. But at the same time, it's very hard for me to be here in the US and know what my family is going through, to know that my 14-year-old is running to an apartment building and luckily finding the door unlocked so he can go into a bomb shelter. Dorit is trying to build a new business, and it's a struggle because she's finding it hard to concentrate and hard to gain momentum when all this other shit is happening in the country at the same time. Now, have I thought about leaving Israel? Have I thought that maybe ad matai, until when, my family, that we've given enough, that maybe we should just leave and move somewhere else? Yeah, I'd be lying to you if I didn't admit that. It definitely has crossed my mind. Maybe we should just leave already. We've done enough. I've served in the army as a volunteer. I put two kids through the army. We've lived there. I've written books about it. I've done enough to talk positively about Israel and spread the love. Maybe my time is done. Maybe it's time for something else. But logistically, first of all, I just don't see it happening. I have a daughter who's in the process of going through her own induction into the army, and her induction date is December 2025. And she's really adamant about going in. She said if we were to leave the country, she would stay and be a lone soldier. And I'm not going to leave her to serve in the army, and while I live somewhere else. But also, honestly, I don't know where I would go. Before we moved to Israel, my family and I backpacked around the world for 1 year. We went to South America, we went to Australia, Japan, India, Thailand. It was an amazing trip. I don't feel we could do that trip again in the same way. I feel like, as a family who speaks Hebrew, as a family where our kids have Israeli sounding names, as a family who's Jewish, I would not feel comfortable traveling the world or living in Europe or being elsewhere right now. And in terms of the US, besides just the crazy political situation in the US and who knows what the next 4 years are going to be like, there's also the idea that at the end of the day, I still want to raise my kids in Israel. I still believe that the future of Judaism is in Israel, not in the United States. And that's not to put the US down for those of you who are living here or building lives here. But I think ultimately the real future of Judaism is in Israel. We're just going through a very tough time right now. So of course it's crossed my mind to leave, though honestly, I don't see it happening. The bottom line is we're all kind of exhausted And I would not be surprised if a lot of you are exhausted as well. It is tough to care about Israel right now. It is tough to be Jewish wherever we are. And maybe in 20, 30 years from now, we'll look back and realize just how pivotal an era these few years are in not just the scope of Israeli history, but in Jewish history overall. But to actually live through them, to be living through this history, it's tough for all of us and for those living in Israel, especially. I do want to touch really briefly on what happened in Amsterdam. I think it was 8 or 9 days ago at this point. I didn't talk about it in depth in last week's pod. By now, we've all heard the stories of what happened, that it wasn't just that they were attacked, but that even taxi drivers were getting out of their cabs and aiding the attackers and in the beatings of Israelis, that Israelis had to hole up in hotel rooms. You can read those sort of details. What I want to give you is the Israeli perspective on it. A couple months ago, I had a podcast called Where the Fish Pishes. Sorry. A few months ago, I had a podcast called Where the Fish Pisses, Efo Hadag Mashtin. This is an expression in Hebrew, Efo Hadag Mashtin, and it really means reality sets in. And that's how Israelis are looking at this incident in Amsterdam, that finally Europeans are seeing where the fish pisses. I mean, where do fish piss? Right in their own water. They poison their own environment when they defecate, right? And that's the whole idea here, is that for all of Europe, for all of Europe's criticism of Israel, for all of their marches against Israel and pro-Palestine, etc., what they're really realizing is that at the end of the day, it's going to come back to bite them. It's their own countries who are going to suffer. And so much of what's happening right now is just the inability to say what is remaining unsaid. I would imagine that the vast, vast majority of Dutch people and Europeans overall are horrified by what they saw, not just because of how Jews were treated, but even more so by what's happening to their own country, by how their country is being overrun by Arab populations who are not assimilating and becoming European, but who are setting up their own neighborhoods, their own enclaves, and who are allowing their youth to run rampant through the communities and destroy what these European communities want to be. And it's hard to say that because of political correctness and in bigotry and racism. But the fact of the matter is, here's how Israelis are seeing it: that sof sof hem yiru efo hadag mashtin, that finally Europeans are seeing where the fish pisses, and that this is a problem for them as well. It is not just Israel's problem. That's the Israeli take on it. Now, will it lead to more sympathy for Israel? I don't know. But Israelis are seeing that, hey, Europe, wake up. This is your problem too. We're going to take a quick break, and then I'm going to come back with your questions. Welcome back to Inside Israel. Here's a couple questions. I got a few questions from you guys this week that were similar, sort of combined them. This one is from Paul. Paul said, Joel, I'd love to hear your opinion on Trump's cabinet picks. And as I've said before on the pod, like, my expertise is not, the geopolitics and the points of view of each cabinet pick. So I don't really want to go there. And that's not really the subject of this pod, Trump's cabinet picks or political appointees. What I do want to talk about is sort of the Israeli angle, what's shaping up in terms of this new American government that's coming in. First of all, I think we need to acknowledge just how strange and bizarre it is that when it came to the topic of Israel, Gaza, Lebanon, the Middle East, Muslims and Orthodox Jews favored Trump. I mean, how bizarre is that? That both Muslims and Orthodox Jews thought Trump was the one who was going to help their side in terms of the Middle East. Now, this past week, a lot of Muslim leaders and the Muslim population in general in the U.S. have said that they're disappointed with Trump's cabinet picks. We're talking about Marco Rubio as Secretary of State because Rubio has said that he does not believe there should be a ceasefire in Gaza and that Hamas should be absolutely destroyed. So a lot of Muslims are upset that such a hardliner pro-Israel senator has been picked for the role of Secretary of State. We're talking about Elise Stefanik, who's a representative in Congress, and she was the one who stood up to all those college presidents, that she's been selected to be the ambassador to the UN. She's called the United Nations a, quote, cesspool of anti-Semitism, which I think we can all agree it is. And then, of course, there's Mike Huckabee, who said he would be the new ambassador to Israel, and he stated that he does not believe the two state solution is workable, and he's not necessarily against Israel annexing the West Bank. At least that's what he's implied. And so a lot of Muslims are upset with these picks. And all I can say to them is, what were you thinking? I mean, the Muslims who supported Trump, you must have been delusional. Did you really think that Trump was going to support you and not Israel? The writing was on the wall. And here's how I know. A few weeks before the election, Miriam Adelson, who is the widow of the casino tycoon Sheldon Adelson, staunch pro-Israel supporter, Miriam Adelson gave Trump a gift of $100 million a few weeks before the election. Now, I can assure you that this was not a blank check kind of gift. This was not a gift where you simply say, okay, here's a gift, you do whatever you want. I can assure you that Miriam Adelson had some sort of one-on-one meeting with Trump where he assured her and made certain promises as to what his policy would be toward Israel, maybe even including who the cabinet picks would be and what their stance on Israel would be. There is no way that you give a gift of $100 million and simply say, do what you want, I support you. It had to come as a quid pro quo. There's no doubt that she had to have assurances that he would support Israel in very strong and obvious ways. So the moment that Miriam Adelson gives $100 million to Trump, I think the Muslim community need to realize that he was not going to be on their side. And I fault them for anyway deciding to support Trump. That is on them, not on him, because the signs were there. Now, what's my opinion of Trump's picks? I'll tell you this. I'm certainly glad that we have a Secretary of State who's not going to handcuff Israel because, in my opinion, what Biden and Harris did was absolutely deplorable. We had one of the most obvious incidents of terrorism happen in the history of the world on October 7th. It is so clear that that was not a protest. It was not about occupation. It was not about freedom. It was simply an act of brutal and graphic aggression against Jews and against Israelis. And Biden and Harris, what they should have said was, this is deplorable. This is unacceptable. Israel has every right to defend itself by any means possible and to wipe Hamas out, and we will do whatever is necessary to support them. And when when civilian casualties mounted in Gaza, what Biden and Harris needed to say was, this is happening because Hamas uses civilians as human shields. And instead, what Biden and Harris did was they always wrung their hands and they spoke out of both sides of their mouth saying, we support Israel, but we're horrified by the civilian casualties in Gaza and there needs to be some sort of ceasefire. I mean, how do you call for a ceasefire when there are still hostages being held in Gaza? Not just hostages, but American citizens are still being held in Gaza. It's so obvious that humanitarian aid is being looted and stolen by Hamas. And yet, Harris and Biden would never, ever concretely come out and say this. So, to me, I'm glad that we have some cabinet picks who are vehemently pro Israel and who are not going to handcuff Israel and who are not going to hold up arms shipments. Now, I think there is a problem with someone like Mike Huckabee who might support Israel's annexation of the West Bank, because at the end of the day, I've said this before, Israel's biggest challenges are the internal challenges. Israel's biggest obstacle to its own future is how to handle with the strife within Israeli society, the ultra-Orthodox not serving in the army, West Bank settlers who violently torch Palestinians' homes and cars, as happened this past week. So the idea, while it might sound good to have, someone who says Israel can do what it wants, Israel can annex the West Bank if it wants, for the day-to-day Israelis who live in Israel, I think annexing the West Bank would actually lead to more problems than to better lives and a solution. So I don't want just blank check support of Israel. I want nuanced support. I want guidance that will actually lead to a better future for Israel and Israelis. So I'm not saying that these picks are perfect, and certainly the Huckabee one concerns me a little bit. But it is certainly a nice change from the hand-wringing, from the wishy-washiness and waffling that we saw from the Democrats, who I think dug their own grave by not supporting Israel vehemently and strongly, because Israel can, I think the world can see what Israel is up against. Next question is from Rena. Rena asked, what's with the government moving Negev Bedouin from their villages in the middle of everything else happening in Israel right now? I'll read that question again. What's with the government moving Negev Bedouin away from their villages in the midst of everything else happening in Israel right now? So this is a story you can look up. It's sort of long and complicated. The idea is that Israel is destroying a number of Bedouin villages in the Negev, in the south of Israel, in order to build some new Orthodox Jewish villages in the Negev. And rather than go into the details of what exactly is happening, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview, some of the basics. These Bedouin villages are unrecognized, so they're not official Israeli towns. It's more like they were squatting and have built up villages around the Negev. And there are several of these. If you drive through the south of Israel, you'll see these Bedouin villages pretty much everywhere. There are quite a few of them. There's been a long legal battle over whether the government had the right to destroy these villages. The Bedouin were offered land in nearby official Bedouin villages, but the Bedouin claimed that there wasn't enough land there for them, that it wouldn't really adequately provide them what they need. Here's what I think matters most in this situation. The Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal security service, the Shin Bet is against this decision. The Shin Bet is against the decision to destroy these villages for the simple reason that they feel it could lead to more internal unrest among Israel's Arab and Bedouin population. And as I've said before and said just a few minutes ago, Israel's biggest challenge is the internal strife happening within Israel. And the last thing we need is uprising and rebellion from our Arab population within Israel's borders. So here, in a situation that's complicated and that I might not fully understand, I'm just going to defer to the Shin Bet. If the Shin Bet is saying that this should not be happening, then I would have to agree that it should not be happening. It's not in the best interest of Israel and Israelis to make this kind of a move right now. But I think what we're seeing is a government that really is seizing the opportunity to take as much land as possible and build up not just Jewish, but Orthodox Jewish villages. That's what this coalition wants. Sort of be damned, even if the rest of the population doesn't want it, even if it could ultimately harm Israel's security in the future, they don't care. They are a coalition and a government that are out for themselves and want to accomplish as much as possible in the 2 years remaining that they're going to be in power. But I would have to defer to the Shin Bet and say, if they think it's not a good move, then Joel also believes that this is not a good move. That wraps it up for today's episode of Inside Israel. Our next live episode will take place next Monday. It's going to be on Monday, the 25th of November, not on Sunday. We're going to go to Monday of next week. And that's simply because of the tour schedule. I'm traveling all day Sunday, but it will be on Monday, the 25th for the live episode. And I'll send out that link and a reminder this coming Thursday in the newsletter. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, you don't get it already, I put that link in the chat. It's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. And please continue to send me your questions throughout the week. I know there's a lot of complicated stuff going on. I will always do my best to help you make sense of it to the extent that I can. Again, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Thank you so much for joining today. I look forward to speaking with all of you next week. Until then, Rak Shalom, only peace and a bit of tranquility for all of us. להתראות.